Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is Jacob Toman and today we are asking the question, what was the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre? For those of you who are new to the channel, you can like, subscribe, and ding the bell for more videos just like this one. Today we are asking this question and answering it with the help of a lot of history. In short, this was a series of violent actions that took place in 1572 in Paris, France. It has some wide-reaching ramifications, and it's also got some historical context that's important for us to take consideration as we try to answer this question of what was the events of the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. So first off, one group of historians refer to the events of the day of St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572 as the worst of the century's religious massacres. Now, we're talking about a period in European history that was in the midst of a massive amounts of religious and political upheaval. We've got wars with the Ottoman Turks, with German princes, with the Pope, with Swiss mercenaries, with France, and with England. We've got all sorts of various ethnic massacres that are going on, religious massacres that are going on, and this particular massacre is, at least by some, accounted as the worst of this particular century's massacres of a religious nature. At the time, France was in a political and religious struggle, primarily between Catholics and Protestants. So in France, you'll often hear us talk about French Huguenots as well as French Catholics. And this, of course, build-up and this tragedy of St. Bartholomew's Day was indeed a tipping point in one of the conflicts of the French religious wars between Catholics and French Protestants, who are known as Huguenots. The massive outbreak of violence would be marked by many as simply a turning point in the wars between Catholics and Protestants. Up until this point, there had been several smaller wars that had gone on, and I use small not lightly here, but simply to say smaller in comparison with the grander scheme of things. These were mostly internal wars that were going on inside of France, but of course there were also external wars as well. There was always the English threat, as well as the spread of Protestantism coming from Germany. And so the way how these wars shaped up were massive, and the death tolls were massive in the 1500s. So when I say smaller war, I simply mean in terms of geographic scope. I don't necessarily mean in political significance or in significance of the loss of life. I simply mean just in terms of the geography that it covered. So these several smaller internal French struggles that occurred throughout the middle of the 1500s, of course, culminated with this massive event of St. Bartholomew's Day. And any student of the Reformation and of this period of European history ought to know the events of St. Bartholomew's Day, because they're quite a turning point for the entire nation of France, and they have a ripple effect throughout Europe and even into North America today. But we'll get to that towards the end of our discussion today. So originally, this particular day's events began as an assassination attempt on prominent Huguenot leaders. We don't have evidence at the moment through our history and through our study of various documents that are surviving from the 1500s. We don't have evidence that this was some grand conspiracy to exterminate every Protestant in Paris. We don't have any kind of evidence that would say that this was an attempt to exterminate every single Protestant in France. But what we do have is we do have several pieces of evidence that point to this being an assassination attempt that then spread like wildfire throughout the rest of France. Well, why all of the violence on St. Bartholomew's Day? Well, the build-up to it and the context of it is multi-layered, and it's really tough to pin down exactly where to start for this discussion. As an enthusiast of history, it's always really, really tough to say when did this particular thing happen, or what was the turning point of this other thing, or why exactly did this build-up bubble over into this massive event that we now know hundreds of years later. Well, in this case, with St. Bartholomew's Day, we can at least point as early as 1570, 2 years prior, where a peace treaty was signed, and this particular peace treaty ended a period of 2 years of internal civil war in France between Protestant Huguenots and Catholics. However, this was an uneasy peace, and there were still violent actions that were going on in between the years of 1570 to 1572, just nothing on the scale of what would happen at the outbreak of St. Bartholomew's Day. One of the leading Catholic figures in France was the Queen Mother Catherine de Medici. Now, she is important because she's the Queen Mother, and as the king at that point in time, who was Charles the Ninth, as the king was growing up, she was essentially his regent, or essentially functioning as king. Oftentimes, she would simply make decisions. Kings who were too young to assume the throne would, of course, have various advisors, whether or not they were declared regents or not. And his mother at this point in time, who is one of the single most fascinating characters in all of history. If you ever want just some riveting stories to be told of political intrigue, of deception, and of, frankly, of death and murder and power and rises to power, you can simply study Catherine de Medici, and you will see a life that was lived that would fit well on a movie or on an HBO series. So anyway, the point being, she planned to give her daughter Margaret, who is pictured here on the right of your screen. Catherine is on the far left, there dressed in black. Her daughter Margaret was planned as a Catholic to be married to a Protestant, a Huguenot, one of the leaders of the Huguenot movements at that time, Henri of Navarre. Now, this marriage displeased the Pope and was not something that was seen as a good thing from Catholics at the time. This was a concession on the part of the political majority, being Catholics, to a political minority in the Huguenots. So the Pope at the time, Gregory XIII, did not approve of this marriage. And at least some of the Pope and the Vatican's reaction is given to us in this medal that is displayed. You can see that displayed here. And it's given with the Latin words, overthrow of the Huguenots. This was a medal that was commissioned and displayed at the Vatican after the events of St. Bartholomew's Day. So at least some folks in the Vatican were happy with the destruction of many of the Huguenot leaders on St. Bartholomew's Day. And on this particular medal, you can see there's an angel, as it were, appearing on one side of the coin, destroying and going with a sword, attacking Huguenots, and then there is an engraved image of Pope Gregory XIII on the other side of this particular medal. So, to sum up, why was there this violence that took place? Well, we have a geographic region of France with multiple generations of mutual hate between Catholics and Protestants, feuding over political and religious practices of the day. And so the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day was a turning point in this over a century-long period of conflict and of hate, both motivated by political reasons as well as motivated by religious reasons. Well, the day itself, August 24th of 1572, took place in this way. There are a great number of paintings and artist recapturings of the day. In this particular artist recapturing, we have the Queen Mother here walking the streets, observing the various dead Huguenots, the work that was accomplished by those whom she had schemed with for the day. But the day's events itself are detailed as follows. The gates of Paris were closed in order to prevent escape from those Huguenot leaders who were to be targeted by this particular attack. Probably the signal for this attack was sometime between midnight and dawn. The citizens of Paris who were Catholic were then given arms, and King Charles IX's personal Swiss mercenaries were delegated with the task of killing Admiral Coligny. Now, this admiral was a French Huguenot admiral. He was the leading figure of the Huguenot movement at the time, and he had won several battles in previous civil wars in France between Catholics and between Protestants. So he was a leading military figure, he was a leading religious figure, and he was a leading political figure at the time. And in fact, 2 days prior to August 24th, there was an attempt on the admiral's life in Paris as well. So it wasn't as though he was a man who was unwanted as dead, but was rather well known as being wanted as dead. And just, again, 2 days prior had been his life had been attempted upon with an assassination from a window sniper. Well, Coligny was killed and thrown out of a window. A mob mentality then rushes over the rest of Paris, of the armed citizenry, and simply the City of Lights turns into a city of death. The day went on and turned into a massive witch hunt for Protestants across Paris, and then as news of that spread across France for the next 5 days or so, in the late August of 1572, there was wide-sweeping violence, and the violence wouldn't stop then. As news traveled with the events, so too went the spirit of wrath across all of France. Now, the king himself had ordered for peace, and he had specifically ordered for various regional leaders to keep order and to keep the peace, to not allow a massive outbreak, to then eventually lead the nation into another civil war. That being said, there was a series of violent massacres that took place in Toulouse, in Bordeaux, in Lyon, in Bourges, in Rouen, in Orléans, in Meaux, in Angers, La Charté, man, I'm butchering these names, Saumur, Gaillac, Troyes, and Albi. So 13 different provincial cities that were known to take place massacres and at least comparatively, massacre events to what was going on in Paris. And it seemed to be that as the news traveled, so too the spirit of death went alongside with it. Well, this particular painting that is recaptured tells us the events building up to, as well as the events of the day of St. Bartholomew's Massacre. You can see here on the far left of the painting that there is the admiral riding on his horse, and there is a sniper out of a window who is making an attempt on his life. That takes place on August 21st or 22nd of 1572. And then you can see as we continue to progress, you see that eventually the Swiss Guard go into the admiral's quarters, drag him out of bed, kill him, and then throw him famously on the day's events out of a window. That event seems to trigger the populace, which then leads to the widespread violence and the widespread massacres going on that day. So what originally started out as an assassination attempt then turns on into a full-on mob riot with murders in the streets going left and right between Catholics and Protestants. Well, thanks so much for watching. I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the video that we would cover that there was something good that actually came of St. Bartholomew's Day. And this was the verse that I thought of as I was studying and preparing this particular topic. This is from Genesis chapter 50. Verses 19 and 20. This is, of course, when Joseph's brothers come to him in Egypt, and he is now in a position of authority. And these were the same people who had taken Joseph and thrown him into a pit and sold him into slavery. Joseph, in his moment where he has an opportunity for vengeance, an opportunity to allow his wrath to consume him, he says, "Don't be afraid. Am I in place of God? You intended harm to me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." And the Huguenots, as they spread out, and as many of them fled from France in the late 1500s due to the various religious persecutions that they were facing, these weren't simply an infringement upon their rights. This was a widespread war that lasted throughout the entirety of the 1500s between Catholics and between Protestants, with occasional brief moments of peace. You've got to look back and say, what an amazing group of people to stand by their convictions. Many of them who did flee from France, and many of them who even came here to the United States, to North America. Many of them who were earlier settlers than the Puritans coming to the northeastern portion of the United States. We often think of Protestantism here in the United States as being so heavily influenced by the English, but of course there were Huguenots here as well. And so I just think of that, and I thank God for the preservation as well as for his faithfulness in keeping so many Huguenots alive in order to be able to share the good news of Jesus Christ across the world. And that has certainly led and contributed to even to us today here who are Protestants and who claim the faith of Christ Jesus, that we are saved by grace alone through Christ Jesus' justifying work. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope today is the day that you have learned something new and exciting about St. Bartholomew's Day right here on Toman's Tome.